A Narrow Fellow in the Grass by Emily Dickinson is a very small poem prescribed in the syllabus of MA English students of the MG University. The poem belongs to the paper American Literatures. As we know, Emily Dickinson is very famous for her stylistic devices in her poetry. We know that she is a person who had a very secluded life, and likewise was her poetry. They were kind of detached from the other poetry that were published during the 19th century. Dickinson is very peculiar for titling her poetry because she is always found using the very first line of her poem as her poem's title. Likewise is the poem that is under discussion today, that is A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. Dickinson is using very little words to describe about a particular creature in the poem. Interestingly, she is nowhere mentioning what the creature is. Rather, she explains about the feature of the creature, but we find that the creature's features are nothing which are familiar to us. She is detaching us, the readers, from the creature that she speaks about, and finally gives a lot of cue words or lot of clues to make us find the creature. So the poem is more like a riddle. That is an interesting factor regarding the poem. Apart from this, we find that Dickinson uses her own technique of defamiliarization and other formalistic devices like capitalization, personification, etc. So these are typical of Dickinsonian techniques. Before moving into the poem, we must see a few details about the poem. The poem is believed to have written during the 19th century, mid-19th century, particularly in 1865. So the poem was published anonymously. We know that Dickinson was a person who was not too much up to fame or anything. She always had a separated life. She always had a very personal and very detached life from the society. And that is why many of her poems were not published when she was alive. Many of her poems were published posthumously. So this poem under discussion was published anonymously in 1865. After a year, it was titled The Snake and was published in the literary magazine or in the journal titled The Springfield Republican. So it took almost a year for Dickinson to reveal her identity and to correspond it with her own poem. The poem is examining the nature of one of a very familiar creature in nature, but we are not told what the creature is. Instead, as I have told earlier, we are given a lot of clues about the creature. Over to the poem. A Narrow Fellow in the Grass by Emily Dickinson. A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him. Did you not? His notice instant is. So in the very first stanza itself, Dickinson is making the poem her own by the typical Dickinsonian technique of personification. We see that she uses capital letters. That of course is the major signifying feature of personification. We also find that she begins the poem abruptly. She speaks about a narrow fellow in the grass. We are not told what the fellow is, neither in the first stanza, nor in the second stanza, not even in the final stanza of the poem. So we find that she is simply using the Dickinsonian technique of personification. You find the pronoun his, H being capitalized. Then comes the second stanza. The grass divides as with a comb, a spotted shaft is seen, and then it closes at your feet and opens further on. So again, she brings in an imagery, or she is trying to give us a sort of image that of a comb which is parting a hair. She compares the movement of that creature across the grass as if a comb is used to part the hair. The shaft or that long narrow creature is more like a shaft, and it is spotted as well. And then it closes at your feet and opens further on. So the poet finds that when she comes its way, when the creature and the poet crosses its way, the movement of the creature stops, and then it takes a deviation and moves on further, as if it stops its movement in any human encounter. He likes a bogey acre, a floor to cool for corn, but when a boy and barefoot I more than once at noon have passed, I thought a whiplash, unbraiding in the sun. When stooping to secure it, it wrinkled and was gone. So here we find the poet is a female, but the poetic persona, or the speaker of the poem, not the poetic persona, but the speaker of the poem is male here, with the use that with the noun of boy being used. So here we see that the speaker is trying to explain more about the creature, where it resides, and what is its nature. So the creature that the speaker speaks about wishes to live in some bogey acre, that means some sort of wet and marshy land, not somewhere dry and clean, but a place where this creature is found is more wet, and the soil found there would be good for growing corn. So it is more like a wet and very moisture kind of place that we can meet this creature that the poem is all about. So the speaker of the poem is saying that when a boy and barefoot I more than once at noon have passed, I thought a whiplash unbraiding in the sun. So the speaker is saying that as a boy who was loitering in the garden or in the yard barefoot, as a young boy, the speaker has encountered this creature as he was loitering somewhere in the noontime, and the boy immediately, as a young boy seeing this creature, he was startled or he was frightened, and he felt as if that creature was more like a whiplash that is getting unbraided in the sun. So when you look at the poem, you find a lot of images that the poet is trying to bring in. The poet is comparing the creature as if the creature moving through the grass like a comb parting the hair. It is compared with a shaft. And finally, the poet is comparing the creature with that of a whiplash. We know that whiplash is something that is very swift in its movement. Then the poet is saying that the creature appears to be a long thing, something like a whiplash, which is unbraiding in the sun. Unbraiding means untangling itself in the sun. So these are certain images that we will be putting into discussion later after we go through the poem completely. When stooping to secure it, it wrinkled and was gone. So here we find the speaker, who is a very little boy, is trying to catch the creature, but it is very swift in its movement and it escapes to nowhere. In the second last stanza, the speaker describes his connection with the other elements of nature, with other creatures of nature. Several of nature's people I know, and they know me. I feel for them a transport of cordiality, but never met this fellow attended or alone without a tighter breathing and zero at the bone. So here the poet is drawing out a comparison of this creature and the other creatures that is commonly seen in nature. The speaker is saying that he is familiar with the other creatures of nature, maybe other animals, insects, or trees. The speaker is familiar with those things. They are familiar with the speaker as well. And he feels some sort of friendliness, he feels some sort of attachment with these creatures, with the other creatures of nature. But this creature under discussion is never so friendly to the poet or to the speaker. So this fellow is often seen by the speaker somewhere in his garden, attended or alone, along with some other animals. Attended means with some other creatures or alone. But never ever they had exchanged any connection or any sort of friendliness. Whenever the speaker meets the creature, he met the creature with running of fear in his bonds. That much was the fear that the creature has created in the speaker when it is seen. So that is all about the poem. From the first title of the poem, it is now titled A Narrow Fellow in the Grass, but earlier when it was published first, it was titled The Snake. So the very title of the poem itself gives us an understanding the poem is all about a snake. But once the title was changed, it is more like a riddle now. A narrow fellow in the grass. What is a narrow fellow in the grass? Or who is a narrow fellow in the grass is a question for thought. Because nowhere in these 6 stanzas Dickinson spells out the word snake. Instead, she is keeping on giving us a lot of clues about the creature. We understand that Dickinson often uses the themes of death, the themes of love, the themes of bereavement, the themes of loneliness, etc. Sometimes she is very peculiar in establishing her connections with nature. This poem is one of those examples where we find Dickinson trying to establish a connection with nature, but interestingly, she uses this technique of defamiliarization. Dickinson is very famous for the formalistic devices that she make use in her poetry. Defamiliarization is a formalistic technique that Dickinson has used in the poem. Defamiliarization is a technique introduced by Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky, in which he says that the poet or the author can use various techniques to make a daily object or an object of everyday life seem unfamiliar to the readers. We have examples of Tolstoy, we have examples of Dickinson who uses the technique of defamiliarization when they write their poetry or novel. So in this case, we very easily get to know that the poem is all about a snake. For example, the words like the spotted shaft, whiplash, the unbraiding, division of the grass into 2 parts, the movement, the swift movement signified by the image of a whiplash, etc., are certain usages that Dickinson is giving us as clues. Because these usages very easily make us understand the creature that she is speaking about. Nowhere in the poem she speaks about a snake or she says that the creature is a snake, but from these words of the spotted shaft, like that of the grass dividing with a comb, the image of grass dividing, grass getting divided with a comb, the whiplash getting unbraided in the sun. All these images, along with certain words and the fear that is created inside the speaker once he encounters the creature, etc., get us an understanding or gives us an understanding that it is a snake that can be considered as the most terrific creatures on earth. Right from the biblical times, we have evilness attached to snake. We have some kind of terror associated with snake. And finally, the stanza to the end is making us very much sure that the creature that the poet has been speaking about is a snake, because the fear that this person who sees the snake encounters, or the bone chilling fear that is generated inside a person who views a snake itself, connects us back to the idea that it is a creature which is something fearful, something terrific, something which we have to be afraid of. Likewise, the images that I mentioned earlier, whiplash unbraiding in the sun, the spotted shaft, the grass dividing with a comb, etc., signifies a long, wriggling creature which has got a slithery body and which cannot be easily caught. So these clues are leading us to an idea that what creature Dickinson speaks about is a snake. So here we see Dickinson making use of the technique of defamiliarization, because it is quite easy for us to understand, or it is a very familiar creature to us. Like any other common creature of nature, like cat or a dog or a mouse, a snake is also something common and is quite often seen by us because it is seen around our houses, our playgrounds, etc. But Dickinson is using this technique of defamiliarization and making us feel that it is not a snake, but it is something else. Snake is the first image that comes to our mind when we speak about the biblical image of Satan, right, from the book of Genesis. So these are certain immediate connections or immediate images that comes to our mind. But here in the poem, she is detaching our immediate connection and making our brain to think a lot about the creature. There is a kind of delaying of the creature happening. Instead of immediately saying that it is a snake, Dickinson is using a lot of cue words. She is giving a lot of clue images, and thus she is trying to delay the image of the snake from appearing into our minds, and thus she is establishing this technique of defamiliarization in her poem. So we find that this is a very small description of the poem. The poem begins with the shock of encountering the snake. We find that it is a narrow fellow in the grass that the speaker is encountering. The shock of the speaker is very much visible. It moves in a magical way. It slithers away. It moves very fastly. So it is more ghost-like. So these images, the movement of the snake, the terror or the fear that is generated inside the speaker, these things actually make us feel that it is not something common, a creature. Rather, it is something else which may be evil, which may be mystical, which may be something not so common. But when you come towards the end of the poem, by supplying all the cue words, by supplying all those images of whiplash, its swift movement, unbraiding in the sun, then the parting of the grass with that of a comb, the sported shaft, all these images are making us to reach at this common idea of snake. So we find the idea of fear being conveyed through the speaker in the phrases. But when a boy and barefoot, the phrase actually makes the speaker even more vulnerable to the serpent's potential threat. That means the serpent or the snake is little more dangerous. That the fear inside the speaker is being made clear here. So as I have told, the fear and all the other images associating it with its swift movement, its slithery body, its evilness, etc., make us finally come to a conclusion that it is a snake. So Dickinson's poems are very famous for her simplicity, the use of very common words, and its very small size. But the meanings that she uses or she hides within the poem, the techniques that she uses to establish the idea of the poem, etc., makes her poem stand out from the other poems of the times. Defamiliarization is a major formalistic technique that Dickinson had made use here in the poem, because the poem is simply about a silly snake, but by the technique of defamiliarization, she is trying to make the common, known, familiar snake unknown, unfamiliar, uncommon to the readers. By the use of words and images, she is delaying the idea of snake from the readers. Therefore, she tries to delay it. As much as time she tries to delay it, the people keep on pondering about what the thing that the speaker is speaking about, and finally this readers comes to a conclusion that it is a snake that is terrific, that is slithery, that is mysterious, that appears here in the poem by Dickinson. Thank you all.